April 18, 1942. 4 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the heart of Tokyo awakens to an unfamiliar sound, the rising wail of air raid sirens. For a moment, confusion reigns. Japan's capital, the center of an empire that had conquered half the Pacific, was supposed to be untouchable. Yet above the haze, 16 silhouettes carve their way through the morning light. American B-25 bombers, low, steady, and impossibly distant from any known airfield. The sound is hollow and unreal, echoing between the rooftops of a city that has never heard war approach its own heart. Anti-aircraft crews scramble, unsure whether to fire or freeze. Commanders shout orders into telephones that yield only static. For years, Japan's war planners had imagined attack as a one-way road, outward, across oceans, toward other shores. But now, the road had turned back upon them. Bombs fall, small in number, yet enormous in meaning. Fires bloom across factory roofs and wooden neighborhoods. Civilians stare upward through drifting smoke, caught between disbelief and awe. Many think the aircraft must be Japanese, part of an exercise or accident. Others whisper that the impossible has come true. The enemy has found them. On the ground, the fires are quickly contained, and the physical damage is slight. But something deeper burns. Pride. The nation that had laughed at America's weakness now sees its own defenses tested and found wanting. The bombers vanish eastward into the clouds, leaving only trails of smoke and silence behind. In that silence, a question lingers. How had they come so far? Japan's naval officers search their maps, tracing distances that make no sense. The empire's war machine had been built on the certainty of invulnerability, but now that certainty was gone, and far out at sea, on the gray deck of a moving carrier, the secret of how it happened was already fading into the Pacific mist. Hours before Tokyo's sirens began to cry, the North Pacific was a theater of gray waves and bitter wind. On the deck of the USS Hornet, spray lashed across steel as the carrier heaved against the morning swell. The sea was cold, the horizon empty, and upon that narrow, trembling strip of deck sat 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, their wings nearly brushing one another, engines silent, crews waiting. These were medium land-based aircraft, never meant for the ocean, never meant for a carrier. Yet here they were, lashed down by ropes, their propellers glinting like blades in the pale dawn. At the head of the line walked Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a man of calm precision, an aviator, engineer, and gambler in equal measure. His task bordered on the impossible, to fly 16 bombers from a carrier, strike Japan, and somehow reach friendly airfields in China. It was a mission born of audacity and desperation, meant to restore American morale after the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. The odds, everyone knew, were intolerable. Then, at 7:38 a.m., a lookout spotted a Japanese patrol vessel, the Nito Maru. Radio messages flashed across the waves. The task force was discovered. There was no time left. If they delayed, the entire fleet risked destruction before even reaching launch range. The plan had called for a launch just 400 miles from Japan. They were still more than 650 away. Fuel calculations were rewritten in silence. Every pilot knew the truth. They would not have enough to return. Even reaching China would now be a prayer, measured in miles and wind. But Doolittle did not hesitate. He turned to his crews and gave the only command possible. "Launch them all." Engines thundered to life. One by one, the bombers rolled forward into the storm, each rising from the deck's edge by sheer will and momentum. Behind them, sailors watched until the last plane vanished into mist, 16 specks against an endless sky. They did not know it then, But that line of aircraft would carry not only bombs, but the weight of America's first retaliation. And far ahead, over a sleeping empire, disbelief awaited. When the first explosions echoed across Tokyo, the city's morning rhythm froze. Workers in factory courtyards stopped mid-step. School children looked skyward through drifting cinders. For years, newspapers had declared the homeland sacred and safe, an island fortress guarded by divine protection and imperial might. Yet now, over the tiled roofs and government ministries, plumes of smoke rose into the pale April sky. The unthinkable had arrived. The bombs themselves were few, a handful of incendiaries and high explosives. They struck oil depots, factories, and residential blocks, igniting scattered fires that fire brigades quickly contained. The physical damage was slight, almost trivial when compared to the destruction Japan had unleashed on China or the Philippines. But for a nation raised to believe in its own invincibility, the symbolism was devastating. Tokyo, the emperor's city, had been touched by enemy hands. In the war rooms of the Imperial General Staff, disbelief turned to alarm. Maps were unfolded, calculations scribbled, voices raised. "How could this happen?" one officer demanded. The question carried no answer. No American base existed within 1,000 miles. No carrier could possibly have launched such heavy aircraft. And yet, evidence burned just beyond the palace walls. For the first time since the war began, the illusion cracked, and behind it lay fear. That fear quickly hardened into anger. The newspapers that once mocked American weakness now called for vengeance. Propagandists assured the public that the raid was meaningless, a desperate gesture from a dying enemy. But within the Navy and Army commands, the humiliation cut deep. If bombers could reach Tokyo once, they could reach again, perhaps with greater force. Japan's high command resolved that such a breach could never be allowed to happen again. The decision that followed would alter the course of the entire Pacific War. To secure its eastern flank, Japan would strike outward once more, this time toward a small, strategically vital atoll in the central Pacific. Its name was Midway, and the echo of those few bombs over Tokyo was already guiding Japan toward the trap that would decide its fate. Before the war, Japan's confidence rested upon geography. The nation had long believed itself shielded by nature, an island empire ringed by thousands of miles of water, distant from the threats that haunted continental powers. For centuries, the Pacific had been both boundary and blessing, a vast, impassable moat that seemed to confirm the nation's destiny as untouchable. To cross it was to defy the limits of distance itself. In the 1930s, this belief hardened into doctrine. Military planners in Tokyo spoke of Kokutai, the national essence, as something ordained and protected. The oceans were divine armor, the homeland, a sacred realm beyond the reach of foreign invasion. Newspapers printed maps showing concentric circles of defense radiating outward from Japan's shores. Each was meant to reassure. Even the longest enemy bombers could not span such distances. Each line was a promise that the war would always remain out there. Propaganda deepened the illusion. Posters depicted the Pacific as a calm blue moat surrounding an enlightened empire. School children were taught that no foreign soldier could ever set foot upon the sacred soil of the emperor. Even within the Imperial Navy, many officers viewed the Pacific as their domain alone. America's fleets, they believed, were sluggish, its aviators untested, its industry unprepared for war at such scale. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The triumph was dazzling, complete. Battleships burned in rows, aircraft lay shattered on runways. The Japanese press called it a strike from heaven itself. The victory confirmed every story they had told themselves, that Japan could strike anywhere while remaining forever beyond retaliation. The Pacific, once a barrier, was now an empire's playground, yet within that certainty lay the seed of arrogance. Even as their conquests spread across Asia and the Pacific, Japan's leaders dismissed warnings from their own analysts, men who whispered that America's industrial power was only beginning to awaken. To them, the idea that the United States might strike Tokyo within months was not merely improbable, it was absurd. "They will never cross the Pacific," one admiral laughed, staring east across the water that had guarded Japan for centuries. But 4 months later, 16 bombers would rise from the waves, proving that belief wrong in a single morning, and the illusion of divine protection would vanish in the smoke above Tokyo Bay. James Harold Doolittle was not a man defined by rank or ritual. Long before the war, before the world knew his name, he was a pioneer of air, a scientist who treated flight not as instinct, but as an equation. In the 1920s, he had broken world speed records, executed the first outside loop, and earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was both daredevil and scholar, the rare aviator who could calculate the mathematics of a miracle and then climb into the cockpit to prove it. By 1942, America was reeling. Pearl Harbor still smoked in memory. The Philippines were falling. Every newspaper headline spoke of retreat. What the nation needed was not merely a military victory, but a restoration of belief, something bold enough to defy despair. In that void stepped Doolittle, summoned to Washington with a question no one yet knew how to ask. How could America strike back when the enemy was an ocean away? The answer came from his restlessness. Doolittle believed that the limits of technology were only temporary, boundaries waiting to be broken. He proposed something that bordered on lunacy: to launch twin-engine medium bombers, never designed for carrier flight, from the deck of an aircraft carrier. No one had ever attempted such a feat. The Navy said it was impossible, the Army said it was suicidal, the engineers said the math did not allow it. Doolittle listened to them all, then smiled. "That's why we'll do it." Under his supervision, the North American B-25 Mitchells were stripped, lightened, and modified for the impossible task. Extra fuel tanks replaced gun turrets. Bomb loads were adjusted for maximum range. Pilots trained endlessly, learning to coax heavy aircraft into flight from a runway scarcely 500 feet long. Each attempt was a dialogue between gravity and willpower. He led by quiet example, not through speeches, but through precision. Those who served under him said Doolittle never asked what could not be done. He simply asked how soon it would be ready. Behind his calm voice lay a deeper truth. He understood that innovation in war rarely begins with logic. It begins with necessity and the courage to challenge it. In April 1942, that courage would be tested above the stormy deck of the USS Hornet. The experiment was no longer theoretical. 16 bombers waited for the wind, engines humming with the pulse of risk itself. The scientist was about to become the symbol America needed, and his impossible idea would soon change the course of the Pacific War. They gathered on the deck of the USS Hornet in the cold light of dawn. 80 men, 16 crews, each standing beside a bomber that might become their coffin. There were no illusions, no promises of return. The mission they had accepted was one without precedent and without map: to strike the Japanese homeland, then disappear into uncertainty. It was, by every measure, a one-way flight. Each aircraft had been stripped bare. Defensive guns were removed to save weight, replaced with broom handles painted black to mimic rear turrets. Armor plating was discarded. In their place, fuel tanks were welded into every spare cavity of the fuselage. carrying just enough to reach China, if the winds were kind. The mechanics' work was silent, precise, and grim. They were not building weapons so much as extending the reach of defiance itself. The targets were chosen with deliberation: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, industrial hearts of an empire that believed itself beyond reach. The bomb loads were modest: incendiaries, demolition charges, small payloads designed not to destroy, but to demonstrate. It was never about damage, it was about proof that Japan was not invincible, that the war could reach its doorstep. Before launch, the crews gathered in the carrier's wardroom. There they were told the truth. If captured, they could expect torture, execution, or worse. The Japanese military considered air attacks on the emperor's soil an unforgivable crime. Doolittle did not disguise the risk. He simply nodded and told his men that courage was often a calculation, not an emotion. They understood. No one withdrew. Each pilot signed his name, sealed his last letter, and climbed aboard. The sound of the engines rising to life was not merely mechanical. It was human will rendered audible. The sea pitched beneath them, the deck slick with spray, but one by one they took their place in line, facing east toward a continent they would likely never see again. They were not chasing victory. They were carrying belief, a fragile thing in the spring of 1942. What they risked was not only their lives, but the idea that America could still choose audacity over fear. In war, strategy is written in ink, but faith is written in blood. These men had offered both, and as the carrier turned into the wind, Doolittle gave the signal to begin. The human gamble was about to take flight, and the Pacific would never be the same again. For 10 days, the USS Hornet and her escort, the USS Enterprise, carved a silent path through the North Pacific. Together they formed Task Force 16, 16 ships carrying 16 bombers toward a target no fleet had ever dared to approach. The sea around them was gray and endless, broken only by whitecaps and the circling of gulls that had followed too far from land. Above deck, the air was sharp with salt and fuel. Beneath it, the hum of engines and the low murmur of men filled the narrow corridors like the pulse of a single organism moving steadily toward danger. The plan was simple on paper, impossible in practice. Sail undetected to within 400 miles of Japan, launch the B-25 bombers, and then turn back before the fleet could be found. Every calculation balanced on that distance. Any earlier launch, and the crews would run out of fuel long before reaching China. Any later, and the carriers risked annihilation from the air. It was a gamble of minutes and miles, the kind that wartime necessity breeds. On the Hornet's deck, the B-25 sat lashed down, their propellers still, wings slick with sea spray. Sailors moved among them with wrenches and oil cans, checking bolts, tightening clamps, wiping moisture from glass canopies. Each aircraft bore hand-painted nose art and a faint trace of disbelief, the strange sight of land bombers trapped aboard a ship. Some of the men joked to ease the tension, but most spoke little. They knew that beyond the horizon lay the world's most heavily defended coastline. Every day, Doolittle met with the task force commander, Admiral William F. Halsey. Their conversations were clipped, focused. Each hour that passed without discovery felt like a reprieve. Yet the ocean was vast, and Japan's patrol lines were vigilant. Dozens of fishing boats, picket ships, and scout vessels fanned out across the Pacific like a web. They needed only one thread to snap. At dawn, on April 18th, that thread broke. A lookout aboard the Hornet sighted a small Japanese vessel on the horizon, the Nito Maru, one of many converted trawlers acting as early warning eyes for the Empire. Radio intercepts confirmed their worst fear. The ship had already transmitted a contact report. The element of surprise was gone. Halsey and Doolittle stood together on the bridge, staring east into the haze. The fleet was still more than 650 miles from Japan, 250 miles farther than planned. To launch now meant almost certain fuel starvation before reaching China. But to wait was to invite attack. Halsey turned to Doolittle, his decision brief but absolute. "You'll have to go now." There was no protest. Doolittle nodded once, descended to the deck, and gathered his men. The wind was fierce and uneven, the carrier pitching under heavy seas. Each bomber would have barely 467 feet of deck to gain flight, less than 1/10 the distance normally required. Mechanics checked the lashings one final time. The crews strapped in, silent behind their goggles. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle climbed into his plane, the lead aircraft, tail number 40 on 2344. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard Cole, adjusted the controls as spray swept across the windshield. The engines roared to life, vibrating through steel and bone alike. Halsey's flag signal rose. "Good luck, and God bless you." The deck officers waved him forward. Doolittle pushed the throttles full. The bomber lurched down the short runway, wheels pounding the deck as the Hornet plunged into a wave trough. For an instant, the plane seemed swallowed by the sea. Then, with a surge of wind and luck, it lifted, heavy, trembling, but free. One after another, 15 more followed, climbing into the stormy sky. Each took off alone, swallowed by distance, carried east toward the unknown. The sailors below cheered softly as the last bomber vanished into the mist. 16 dots on the horizon, each a fragment of America's fragile hope. Behind them, the carriers turned hard about, retreating westward before the Empire could strike. Ahead, the bombers flew on, buffeted by wind and uncertainty. They were no longer a fleet, just 16 planes chasing history across the largest ocean on Earth. And somewhere beyond that endless gray, Japan awaited its first taste of retribution. For 6 hours, the B-25s flew east, low over the rolling gray waves, engines thrumming in perfect rhythm. The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath them, featureless and cold, as if daring them to continue. Inside each cockpit, the men watched fuel gauges tremble, maps flutter, and time itself tighten. No radio chatter passed between the planes. Only the wind and the hum of engines spoke, a silence of shared resolve. At last, the clouds thinned, revealing the faint outline of land. Japan, the island that had seemed so distant, so unreachable, now lay just ahead. The first sight was not fortresses or gun batteries, but fishing villages, farm fields, and narrow coastal roads. Smoke rose from chimneys. Trains traced ribbons of steam across the plains. For a moment, the crews were struck not by hatred, but by the ordinariness of the place. Civilization, untouched, unaware, resting in the calm before discovery. Then, at 12:15 p.m., Doolittle's lead bomber crossed Tokyo Bay. The target lay directly ahead, the sprawling capital of the Japanese Empire, its factories and arsenals hidden within the dense fabric of the city. Anti-aircraft guns were few and unready. Radar operators, unfamiliar with the silhouette of an American bomber, hesitated to believe what they were seeing. The alarm came too late. The B-25s roared in at rooftop height, so low that pilots could see laundry whipping in the wind, schoolyards filled with frozen children, and tramcars halted mid-intersection. The sound was deafening, a new and foreign thunder rolling through the capital. Doolittle released his bombs first, striking an armory and an aircraft plant near the city center. Moments later, more explosions echoed across Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya. Incendiaries rained down on docks, oil depots, and military supply centers. The precision was imperfect, but the message unmistakable. From the ground, civilians stared upward in disbelief. For months, they had been told the homeland was impregnable, the divine realm of the emperor, beyond the reach of foreign hands. Yet here they were, American planes, their insignia clear against the sky, their engines loud enough to shake windows in the imperial palace itself. Beikoku no Hikoki, American aircraft, the phrase spread through the streets like a tremor of confusion and fear. Anti-aircraft guns finally opened fire, shells bursting across the city, but the bombers were already gone, darting through smoke and cloud, too fast and too low to be tracked. Fighters scrambled from airfields outside Tokyo, yet none found their quarry. In less than 30 minutes, the raid was over. No plane was lost over Japan. Behind them, the city smoldered, not in ruin, but in revelation. The damage to factories and warehouses was modest. The psychological wound was immeasurable. For the first time in its modern history, the Japanese mainland had been struck by a foreign power. It was not destruction that mattered, but intrusion. The walls of invincibility had cracked. In the cockpits, relief was brief. The men checked their instruments, recalculated their bearings. Fuel gauges dipped alarmingly close to empty. The Pacific was now behind them, and before them lay the mountains of central Japan, the East China Sea, and a vast stretch of occupied territory. The danger had shifted from the empire they had just humiliated to the endless geography that waited beyond. One by one, the bombers vanished into cloud and distance, heading west toward an uncertain dusk. None would see the fleet again. None could return. They had struck the heart of the enemy, but their greatest trial was only beginning. For ahead lay China, and the cruel mathematics of fuel, weather, and fate. Night fell like a curtain across the East China Sea. The bombers, scattered and exhausted, pressed west into darkness. Their engines, already strained from the long flight, now coughed and trembled as the first sheets of rain lashed their wings. Lightning flickered through the clouds, illuminating glimpses of mountains rising like black teeth below. Every man aboard knew the numbers by heart. Their fuel gauges had dropped to 0. The arithmetic of survival no longer worked. Navigation was guesswork. Radio silence was absolute. Each crew flew blind through a storm that swallowed both moon and horizon. Some prayed, others focused on their instruments, tracing imaginary lines across maps that no longer matched reality. The plan had ended hours ago. What remained was endurance. The bombers were too far from safety, too low on fuel to reach any designated field in China. There would be no controlled landings, only choices between mountains, rivers, and fate. Shortly after midnight, one by one, the engines began to die. Crews opened bomb bay doors, throwing out every ounce of weight they could spare. When the last drops of fuel were gone, the pilots steadied their planes into the wind and gave the order no aviator ever wants to speak. Bail out. Parachutes snapped open in the rain, their white canopies vanishing into storm and darkness. Men tumbled through cloud, through silence, through uncertainty, falling into a land they could not see. Doolittle himself was among them. Believing the mission a failure, he leapt from his aircraft near the town of Chuchao, plunging into the black void of night. When he hit the ground, tangled in brush and mud, he thought his effort had come to nothing. 16 planes gone. No word from his men, no certainty of rescue. He removed his pistol, ready to end what he believed was disgrace. But dawn came differently. Voices called out. Chinese farmers, risking their lives to find and shelter the foreign flyers who had fallen from the sky. Across the region, villagers and resistance fighters acted with quiet heroism. They hid the downed Americans from Japanese patrols, fed them, dressed their wounds, and guided them through fields and mountains toward safety. For each villager caught aiding the raiders, the penalty was death, and still they did not hesitate. In those days, after the raid, humanity moved quietly through the chaos of war, binding two distant nations with shared courage. By week's end, 15 of the 16 crews had reached friendly Chinese territory. One bomber, low on fuel, diverted south and landed in Vladivostok, where its crew was interned by the Soviets. But for the others, survival itself became the measure of triumph. What Doolittle had believed a failure was, in truth, a miracle, proof that spirit could sometimes fly farther than fuel. In Tokyo, news of the attack and the Americans' escape ignited a storm of rage. The Imperial General Staff demanded retribution, their humiliation raw and public. To avenge the insult, Japan launched a brutal campaign across eastern China, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in a series of anti-air operations meant to root out those who had aided the raiders. The laughter of arrogance that once echoed through Tokyo's war rooms had turned to fury and fear. Doolittle, now safely recovered, was informed that his mission had changed history. He would receive the Medal of Honor. Yet in private, he spoke only of the men and villagers who had made survival possible. The raid was over, but the consequences, for Japan, for China, for the Pacific War itself, were only beginning to unfold. And far across the ocean, a nation that had doubted its strength was waking to a new kind of faith. The flames over Tokyo had barely dimmed when the true fires began, not those of burning buildings, but of wounded pride. The bombs had caused little material loss, yet their impact struck at the very heart of Japan's identity. The myth of divine invulnerability, cultivated through propaganda and belief, lay shattered beneath the thin smoke that still rose over the capital. The nation that had laughed at American weakness now stared into a mirror of its own humiliation. In the war rooms of the Imperial General Staff, rage replaced reason. To the officers who had built their careers on the illusion of control, the Doolittle raid was not simply an attack. It was an insult. Japan's newspapers assured the public that the damage was minor, but privately, the High Command demanded vengeance. And they demanded it not against the unreachable Americans, but against those they could reach. China. By early May 1942, the Imperial Army launched what it called the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign. Its declared purpose was to locate the downed American airmen. Its true aim was retribution. Japanese divisions poured into eastern China with orders to cleanse the countryside, to punish every village suspected of aiding the foreigners who had fallen from the sky. The scale of the violence defied comprehension. Cities such as Yiwu, Kuzhou, and Lishui were razed. Entire populations were executed for crimes as small as offering a drink of water to a wounded pilot. Crops were burned, wells poisoned, livestock slaughtered. The campaign left behind an unbroken trail of ruin, stretching hundreds of miles. Tens of thousands of civilians, farmers, mothers, children, perished beneath the banner of imperial pride. Even the weapons of revenge became atrocities in themselves. For the first time, the Imperial Army employed bacteriological warfare on a wide scale, releasing plague-infected fleas and contaminated food into Chinese villages. What began as retaliation became extermination. The brutality was methodical, bureaucratic, and absolute, an empire lashing out not from strength, but from the terror of being mocked. For Doolittle's men, still scattered in hospitals and safe houses across China, the knowledge of what had followed their rescue was unbearable. The villagers who had sheltered them, fed them, hidden them beneath floorboards, were now being hunted and destroyed. In their diaries, the surviving raiders would write of guilt that never left them, the sense that their survival had cost the lives of countless innocents. Yet history's irony is merciless. Japan's vengeance achieved the opposite of what it intended. Instead of restoring fear, it exposed weakness. The campaign consumed precious men, aircraft, and fuel that could not be spared. It forced Japan to extend supply lines across impossible terrain, draining the same resources needed to defend its ocean empire. In its fury, the empire began to overreach, striking at shadows while its enemies gathered strength. The Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign was not the first act of brutality committed in China, but it marked a shift in purpose, from conquest to punishment, from ambition to rage. The empire that had once envisioned a 1,000-year dominion now found itself chasing ghosts through burned fields, its soldiers haunted by a humiliation they could not erase. Every empire falls hardest after its pride is pierced. In trying to crush the memory of one daring raid, Japan had sown the seeds of its own collapse, and while its armies scorched China in vengeance, another blow, far greater and far deadlier, was already forming beyond the horizon, carried on the steel decks of American carriers sailing toward a place called Midway. The news reached Washington before dawn. Fragmentary reports, uncertain details, but one unmistakable fact: American bombers had struck Tokyo. For a moment, disbelief hung in the air of the War Department like smoke. It could not be possible. The Pacific was too vast, the distances too great, yet confirmation came from intercepted Japanese broadcasts. The capital had been bombed. For the first time since the war began, the tide of humiliation began to turn. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt was briefed, he allowed himself a thin, knowing smile. The scale of the attack mattered little. What mattered was that it had happened at all. 4 months earlier, he had faced a nation bruised and frightened, its fleet shattered in Hawaii, its forces retreating across the Pacific. Now there was proof that the United States could strike back. It was not victory, but it was vindication. When reporters demanded to know where the bombers had come from, Roosevelt paused for effect and replied with a touch of mischief, "They came from our base in Shangri-La." The name, borrowed from a mythical paradise in a popular novel, was no accident. It was part humor, part deception, and wholly symbolic. America's first counterblow had come not from geography, but from imagination, ingenuity, and will. Across the nation, the response was electric. Newspapers splashed the headlines in bold letters: Tokyo bombed, US planes over Japan. Radios carried the story to every small town and factory floor. In homes still hung with the portraits of sons lost at Pearl Harbor, people stood a little taller. The impossible had been made real. For the first time since December 7th, America was not only reacting, it was acting. Enlistment offices overflowed overnight. Young men who had hesitated now volunteered. War bond sales surged. Industrial plants redoubled production, their night shifts burning with new purpose. The nation's morale, once as fragile as glass, hardened into resolve. The Doolittle raid had not crippled Japan's war machine, but it had awakened America's. Meanwhile, the man behind the mission sat in a makeshift barracks in China, convinced he would be court-martialed. Doolittle believed he had failed. All 16 bombers lost, several men missing or captured, and his crews scattered across foreign soil. To an engineer's mind, the numbers did not add up to success. But when he returned home, he found a nation that saw him differently. On May 19, 1942, in a quiet ceremony at the White House, Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around Doolittle's neck. The citation spoke of conspicuous leadership, gallantry, and intrepidity. Behind the measured words lay a simple truth. The raid had transformed despair into direction. In that moment, Doolittle understood that the mission's purpose had never been tactical. It had been spiritual. The Doolittle raid did not alter the map of the Pacific, but it altered the psychology of the war. It reminded a wounded people that courage could cross any distance, that innovation, not invincibility, would decide the future. The Japanese Empire, believing it had humiliated the West, now faced an enemy newly awakened, newly certain of its strength. In every future campaign, from Midway to Iwo Jima, the echo of that first audacious strike would linger. It was proof that America could rise from ashes and turn defeat into momentum. And across the Pacific, as Roosevelt's grin faded and Doolittle's medal gleamed under White House lights, the men of Japan's Navy were already charting their reply, a trap designed to restore their pride, and one that would instead destroy their fleet. The war's balance was shifting, and its turning point was now only weeks away. In war, humiliation is a dangerous teacher. After the Doolittle raid, Japan's high command met not with reflection, but with fury. The unthinkable had happened. American bombers had reached the sacred heart of the empire. The question that consumed every admiral and general was not how it had happened, but how it could ever be allowed again. The raid had revealed a vulnerability no amount of propaganda could conceal. Japan's vast ocean frontier, once considered an impenetrable barrier, had been crossed with ease. To the Imperial General Staff, this was more than a military failure. It was an existential crack in the myth of invincibility. Every man in that room understood that the Emperor's subjects had seen the smoke above Tokyo. Something had to be done. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, proposed the answer. To prevent any future attacks, Japan must expand its defensive perimeter eastward, seize the Midway Atoll, a small coral island more than 2,000 miles from the home islands. Midway, he argued, would serve as an unsinkable shield, the outer wall of Japan's empire. Yet beneath the logic lay emotion, a need to erase the shame inflicted by 16 American bombers. In Tokyo's war councils, dissent was silenced. The plan was approved. The operation, grand in design, called for Japan's 4 most powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, to strike Midway, draw out the remaining U.S. fleet, and destroy it in one decisive blow. What the planners did not know was that their codes had been broken. American intelligence, having intercepted their communications, knew precisely where and when Japan would strike. By early June 1942, the Japanese Armada, more than 200 ships, moved east across the Pacific. To the admirals aboard, the sea seemed calm, the plan perfect, the enemy unprepared. Yet beneath that calm waited an ambush unlike any the Imperial Navy had ever faced. On the morning of June 4th, the sky over Midway erupted. American carrier aircraft, launched from Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, struck in waves. Bombs found their mark with ruthless precision. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning wrecks. Later that day, Hiryu, the last to remain afloat, was hit and set ablaze. By dusk, all 4 lay beneath the Pacific. In a single day, Japan lost its most experienced pilots, its most powerful ships, and its ability to dictate the tempo of the war. The empire that had expanded with unstoppable momentum was suddenly bleeding from within. Yamamoto, standing aboard his flagship Yamato, received the reports in silence. He had sought to avenge Tokyo. Instead, he had delivered Japan's fleet to ruin. The consequences went far beyond the battlefield. The loss at Midway ended Japan's strategic initiative. Never again would it launch an offensive of such scale. From that moment onward, the war turned, slowly, relentlessly, against it. The empire's reach had exceeded its grasp. The irony was cruel. The Doolittle raid, dismissed at first as a nuisance, had provoked a reaction so vast it fractured the very power it sought to protect. In trying to defend the homeland, Japan had overextended its fleet and doomed its dominance. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, names once whispered with reverence, now vanished beneath the sea. With them sank hundreds of Japan's finest aviators, the men who had once set Pearl Harbor ablaze. Their loss was not merely tactical, it was generational. Across Tokyo, the propaganda continued. Officials spoke of temporary setbacks, of victories still to come. But in the corridors of the Navy Ministry, the silence was heavier than the words. The laughter that had once followed the Doolittle raid, the laughter of disbelief and arrogance, was gone. On the endless blue of the Pacific, where 4 proud ships had burned and sunk, only silence remained. And from that silence, the fall of an empire had already begun. Victory, when it finally came, was not measured in land or ships or medals. It was measured in absence, the silence of those who did not return. The Doolittle raiders had achieved what the world believed impossible, yet every triumph leaves a shadow. Beneath the headlines of heroism lay a toll few would ever see, and fewer still would understand. Of the 80 men who took off from the Hornet, 8 were captured by the Japanese after crash landing in China. They were hunted across mountains and rice fields, betrayed by circumstance and exhaustion. In occupied territories, mercy was a word without meaning. The prisoners were paraded as trophies, interrogated, and condemned not as soldiers, but as criminals. 3 were executed by firing squad. 1 died slowly in captivity. The others endured years of starvation and isolation before liberation. For them, survival was not victory, it was endurance. They had entered the war as airmen, daring and young. They emerged as witnesses to its cruelty. When later asked about his captors, one survivor said only, "We did our duty, and so did they." It was not forgiveness, but understanding, the kind of clarity born from pain, yet the greater suffering was not theirs. It belonged to the land that had sheltered them. In the months following the raid, Japan's vengeance descended upon China with a scale of horror rarely spoken aloud. Entire provinces were scoured in the search for downed airmen and those who had aided them. Villages were destroyed, crops poisoned, rivers polluted with corpses. The Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign left an estimated 250,000 civilians dead. Among them were the same villagers who had fed the Americans, who had hidden them in barns and guided them through the night. Their kindness had become a death sentence. To the Japanese command, the Doolittle raid was not simply a strike on Tokyo. It was an assault on honor, and the reprisal would be total. The ashes of Chinese towns bore silent witness to the cost of symbolism. When Doolittle learned of the massacres years later, the weight of it never left him. He was a soldier, but also a man who understood consequence. He would later say, quietly, "War's victories are written in pain, not pride." He did not mean to diminish the courage of his men, nor the power of their achievement, but to remind history that every act of defiance carries a price, and often that price is paid by the innocent. The Doolittle raid became a legend, but legends are imperfect things. They inspire, but they also conceal. The image of brave men soaring into enemy skies remains etched in memory, yet behind it lies the truth of those left on the ground, the nameless farmers, mothers, and children whose sacrifice was never recorded. History remembers courage, but not always the cost it demands of others. For the United States, the raid restored faith. For China, it brought suffering beyond measure. Between those two truths lies the moral complexity of war, that the same act can redeem one nation and devastate another. Symbolism can move nations. It can turn fear into unity, despair into strength. But symbolism also burns. It consumes those caught beneath its light. And as the world celebrated the audacity of 16 bombers, the embers of that light still glowed across eastern China, faint, red, and enduring. Proof that even the smallest victories in war are never free. When the surviving Doolittle raiders finally returned home, there were no parades waiting on the docks. Their mission had been shrouded in secrecy, their escape uncertain, their journey scattered across continents. They arrived quietly, thinner, older in spirit, carrying the weight of what they had seen and the ghosts of those left behind. In their silence lay both triumph and remembrance, not of victory, but of endurance. In the months that followed, the nation learned their names. Newspapers printed their faces, school children memorized their story, and the press called them heroes. The word never sat comfortably with them. To the men who had flown through storm and smoke, the raid was not a story of glory, but of necessity. "We were just doing what had to be done," one of them would later say. They did not celebrate what they had accomplished. They mourned what it had cost. In time, they built lives again. They became engineers, teachers, fathers, citizens of a world remade by war. Yet once a year, they gathered, a dwindling brotherhood that refused to forget. Their reunions were not public spectacles, but solemn rituals held in quiet halls where laughter and grief existed side by side. They drank from a set of silver goblets, one for each of the 16 crews who had taken off from the Hornet. Each goblet bore a name, engraved in steel and memory. When a raider passed away, his cup was turned upside down, never to be used again. As the years went on, more goblets stood inverted. The circle grew smaller. The toasts became slower, softer, and yet, in that stillness, the meaning of their mission deepened. What they had awakened in 1942 was not vengeance, it was resolve. They spoke rarely of the raid itself. When they did, their words were measured, almost reluctant. They remembered the faces of villagers who had helped them, the friends who had not come home, the sound of engines lifting off into uncertain sky. For them, heroism was not in the bombing of Tokyo, but in the courage to climb aboard in the first place, knowing full well they might never return. By the time the last survivors grew old, the Doolittle raid had become legend, taught in classrooms and filmed for cinema. Yet even as the world around them turned their story into myth, the men themselves remained ordinary in bearing, modest in tone. They knew that history's grandeur is built on human fragility, on fear mastered for a moment, on faith held against impossible odds. At their final reunion in 2013, only a handful remained. They lifted their glasses one last time, to absent friends and fading memory. The air was heavy with silence, but not sorrow. "We were lucky," one whispered, "lucky to have flown, lucky to have survived. Lucky to have served when the world needed courage most. Their raid had changed the war, but their legacy reached beyond strategy or victory. It reminded humanity that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it simply endures, that even when nations fall and empires burn, a single act of defiance can awaken something larger, the will to keep going. In the end, the sleeping giant they stirred was not only America. It was the human spirit itself, restless, wounded, but unbroken. The Doolittle raid began not with the intention to destroy, but to defy. It was conceived in the quiet corners of desperation, a gesture against despair, a declaration that faith itself could take flight. In April 1942, 16 bombers rose into a storm of uncertainty, carrying not superiority of arms, but the audacity of will. Their bombs were few, their effect small, yet the echo they left behind would roll through history far longer than any explosion. War is often remembered by its scale, the battles that consumed oceans, the weapons that reshaped continents. But sometimes, history turns on an act so improbable it transcends strategy. The Doolittle raid did not cripple Japan's industry or halt its armies. It struck at something deeper, belief. For an empire built on divine confidence, the sight of foreign aircraft over Tokyo was more than a shock. It was revelation. The laughter that had once followed Pearl Harbor died in the same fires it had kindled. In that moment, the myth of invulnerability was undone. Japan's overconfidence led it eastward to Midway, where its proud fleet vanished beneath the waves. One act of defiance had forced an empire into error. What began as a symbolic strike became the hinge upon which the Pacific War turned. But the raid's legacy was not measured in victories alone. It showed the world that courage could outfly reason, that when logic insists something cannot be done, conviction sometimes proves otherwise. The image of those bombers lifting from a heaving deck, their wheels barely clearing the sea, became more than military history. It became metaphor, a testament to human endurance, to the quiet courage that defines those who act when failure seems certain. In the decades that followed, technology changed. Bombers grew faster, weapons more precise, wars more distant. Yet the symbolism of that April morning remained. It endures not in the machinery, but in the meaning, the understanding that morale, faith, and resolve can move mountains that technology cannot. The Doolittle raiders carried no illusions of grandeur. They knew they were unlikely to return. But by flying, they reminded the world that defiance, when born of necessity, can reshape destiny itself. Today, their story is recounted not as myth, but as memory, a thread woven into the fabric of a century defined by conflict and courage. Their mission reminds us that hope is often the rarest resource in war and the most powerful. The 16 bombers never returned, yet their impact still circles the earth, rippling through every act of quiet bravery that dares to challenge the impossible. They proved that a small band of men could shake an empire, that belief could be weaponized without hate, and that in the darkest hours of humanity, a single spark of resolve can light the way forward. They thought it was a joke. It became the spark that awakened the giant.